The night my ex-wife and her lawyer showed up at my mother's funeral reception demanding 60% of her restaurant empire, I told them to get out. 2 days later, someone contaminated our entire central supply warehouse with industrial cleaner. Every ingredient, every sauce, every signature spice blend, my mother spent 30 years perfecting, destroyed. I rushed to the warehouse expecting devastation. But when I walked through those doors, I started laughing, because the warehouse they poisoned wasn't ours anymore. My name is Nathan Cole, and this is the story of how the people who tried to destroy my mother's legacy ended up burying themselves instead. Before I get into everything, I want to know you're here with me. Drop a comment below, tell me where you're listening from, or just say hi. It means more than you know, especially with a story like this one. And if you want to follow what happens next as I rebuild everything my mother fought for, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps. Now, let me tell you how this all started. My mother, Grace Cole, built something most people said was impossible. She started with a single diner in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago when she was 23 years old, pregnant with me, and working 2 other jobs just to cover rent. That diner turned into a restaurant. That restaurant turned into 3. And by the time I was finishing college, Grace Cole's Kitchen had become a $200 million farm-to-table chain stretching across the Midwest. 47 locations, over 3,000 employees, a name that meant something to people who grew up eating at her counter. She died on a Tuesday in October, pancreatic cancer. She had known for 8 months but told no one except her attorney until the very end. That was my mother. She handled her own battles quietly, without asking anyone to carry the weight for her. When I got the call, I was sitting in my office at the flagship restaurant in Lincoln Park, going over next quarter's expansion plan. I remember the light coming through the window. I remember the sound of the phone hitting the desk when my hand stopped working. And I remember thinking that the world had just lost someone it didn't deserve in the first place. The funeral was enormous. People came from every corner of the city. Former employees who had worked her very first lunch shift. Farmers who had supplied her restaurants for decades. City council members. Regulators. Kids from the scholarship program she had quietly funded for 15 years. I stood at the front of that church, trying to hold myself together, trying to say something worthy of the woman who raised me alone and never once complained about it. The reception was held at the original Pilsen location. I was standing near the kitchen, talking with one of my mother's oldest friends, when the front door swung open and Vivian walked in. Vivian Price, my ex-wife. We had been married for 3 years before I found out she had been funneling money from our joint accounts into an investment scheme run by someone I had never met. The divorce was ugly. She fought for everything: the house, the savings, even tried to claim partial ownership of shares my mother had gifted me before the marriage. The judge threw that out, and Vivian walked away with what the prenup allowed, which was far more than she deserved. That was 2 years ago. I hadn't spoken to her since. She wasn't alone. Behind her was a man in a charcoal suit carrying a leather briefcase. I later learned his name was Glenn Harker, a corporate attorney with a reputation for hostile acquisitions. They walked straight toward me, past mourners still holding plates of my mother's famous cornbread, past people still wiping their eyes. Vivian smiled at me the way she used to when she wanted something expensive. "Nathan," she said, "we need to talk about your mother's restaurants." I felt the anger rise so fast it surprised me. "Not here," I said. "Not today." Glenn Harker opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. He placed it on the counter next to a vase of white lilies someone had brought in my mother's memory. "Your mother made verbal commitments," he said, "to multiple parties. We represent stakeholders who are owed a significant share of this company. 60%, to be specific." The room had gone quiet. People were watching. My mother's best friend Dolores had her hand over her mouth. I picked up the folder, glanced at the first page, and set it back down. "My mother didn't owe anyone anything," I said. "And neither do I. Get out." Vivian leaned in close enough that only I could hear her. "You always were stubborn, Nathan. Just like her. And look where that got her." She turned and walked out, heels clicking against the tile floor my mother had picked out herself 26 years ago. I should have called the police right then. I should have called my attorney. But I was burying my mother, and the grief was so heavy I could barely stand, let alone think strategically. That was my first mistake. It would not be my last. 2 nights later, I got a call at 4 in the morning from our operations manager, Ray Durbin. His voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand him. Someone had broken into our central supply warehouse on the south side and contaminated everything. Not stolen, contaminated. Industrial-grade cleaning solution had been poured into sealed containers, injected into vacuum-packed meat shipments, mixed into dry goods. The health department had already been notified. If any of that product had reached a single restaurant, people could have been hospitalized. Maybe worse. I drove there in the dark, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing through every worst-case scenario: lawsuits, shutdowns, the entire chain collapsing under a food safety scandal. Everything my mother built, gone in one night because someone wanted to watch it burn. But when I pulled up to the address Ray had given me, something felt wrong. The building looked right, same industrial block, same stretch of warehouses along Halsted, but the signage was different. The loading dock layout had changed. And then I saw it. A faded permit notice on the side door, dated 14 months ago, issued to a company called Lakefront Storage Solutions. This wasn't our warehouse. I called Ray and told him to check the address again. He went silent for 10 seconds, then came back sounding confused. The contamination happened at 4501 South Halsted. Our warehouse was at 4501 South Halsted until 11 months ago, when my mother quietly moved the entire supply operation to a new facility in Cicero. She had transferred everything under a separate LLC that wasn't publicly connected to Grace Cole's kitchen. I stood in that parking lot at 4:30 in the morning and laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because my mother, even from beyond the grave, had outsmarted every single person who wanted to hurt her. She had moved the heart of the operation without telling anyone outside her most trusted circle. Whoever poisoned that warehouse had destroyed someone else's inventory, based on outdated information. But then my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize, with a video attached. I tapped play. Vivian appeared on screen, standing outside the warehouse in the dark, smiling into the camera. Behind her, a man I didn't recognize was walking out of the building carrying empty containers. "Consider this your eviction notice, Nathan," she said. "No restaurants without supplies. No supplies without a warehouse. And no warehouse anymore." She blew a kiss at the camera and the video ended. She had filmed herself. She had actually filmed herself committing a federal crime and sent it to me like a greeting card. My mother used to say that arrogance was just stupidity wearing a nice suit. She was right. I saved the video, backed it up to 3 separate drives, and forwarded it to my attorney before the sun came up. But I didn't go to the police yet, because something about the man in that video, the one walking out of the building behind Vivian, bothered me. I had seen him before. I just couldn't place where. The next morning, I went to my mother's house in Oak Park. She had lived there for the last 15 years. A modest craftsman bungalow that looked nothing like the home of someone worth $200 million. That was Grace Cole. She never needed anyone to see her success. She just needed to know it was real. I hadn't been inside since before the funeral. Walking through the front door hit me harder than I expected. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen table. A cookbook she had been annotating sat open on the counter, notes scrawled in her sharp handwriting. The house smelled like her lavender soap and ground cumin. I had to sit down on the hallway stairs and just breathe for a while. I had come looking for answers. My mother was meticulous. If she had anticipated trouble after her death, she would have left something behind. I searched her study, first filing cabinets, desk drawers, even the safe behind the painting of Lake Michigan she had bought at a street fair. Nothing unusual. Tax records, property deeds, insurance documents, all clean. Then I went to the kitchen. Not the regular kitchen, the test kitchen she had built in the basement. The room where she developed every recipe, where she spent entire weekends experimenting with flavors and textures, where she taught me to make her cornbread when I was 8 years old and barely tall enough to reach the counter. The room was exactly as she had left it. Copper pots hanging in order, ingredient jars lined up by category, and there, taped to the inside of her recipe binder, the one she never let anyone touch, was an envelope with my name on it. "Nathan, open this when things stop making sense." My hands were shaking before I even tore the seal. Inside was a letter, handwritten, dated 3 weeks before she died. She wrote that she knew someone would try to take the company after she was gone. She said she had spent the last year preparing for it, moving assets, restructuring ownership, documenting threats she had received. She told me to find the backup server she had installed in the Cicero facility, protected by a password only I would know. The name of the dish I burned the first time she let me cook alone. Blackened catfish. I almost smiled. But then came the part that stopped me cold. She wrote, "Be careful with Derek. He is not who you think he is. Derek Malone. My half-brother. Same mother, different father. He was 5 years older than me, and we had never been close. He had worked in the company's supply chain division for a decade, before leaving 3 years ago to start his own consulting firm. My mother had always spoken carefully about Derek, never critical, but never fully warm either. I always assumed it was complicated family dynamics. Now I wasn't sure. I drove to the Cicero facility that afternoon. The building looked like any other industrial space from the outside, but inside it was immaculate climate-controlled storage rooms, a full digital inventory system, security cameras covering every angle. My mother had built a fortress and told almost no one. I found the backup server in a locked utility room, entered the password, and spent the next 4 hours reading through files that rewrote everything I thought I knew. My mother had been investigating a coordinated effort to undermine her company for over 2 years. Someone had been leaking proprietary recipes and supplier contracts to a competing chain called Harlow and Pine, a fast-growing farm-to-table brand that had been aggressively expanding into our markets across the Midwest. The emails on the server showed communication between an anonymous sender and Harlow and Pine's CEO, a man named Victor Stahl. The anonymous sender had been providing detailed financial projections, internal strategy documents, and even my mother's personal recipe formulations, the ones she had never published, the ones that made Grace Cole's kitchen irreplaceable. And the IP address those emails originated from traced back to a consulting firm registered in Evanston, Illinois, Derek's firm. I sat in that utility room, staring at the screen, until the overhead lights clicked off on their timer. My own brother. My mother had known, and she had chosen to handle it without telling me. The letter made sense now. She hadn't warned me outright because she knew I would confront Derek immediately, emotionally, without enough evidence to make it stick. She wanted me to find the proof myself, when I was ready to act with precision instead of anger. The following day, I called Derek and asked him to meet me at the original Pilsen restaurant. He showed up looking relaxed, even sympathetic. He hugged me at the door and said he was sorry he hadn't been around more since Mom passed. I nodded, said nothing, and led him to a booth in the back. I asked him directly, had he been in contact with Vivian? He hesitated for half a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew, then shook his head. Not since your divorce, he said. Why would I be? I set my phone on the table and played a recording my mother had saved on the server. Derek's voice, clear as daylight, discussing the contamination plan with someone whose voice I didn't recognize at the time. He talked about targeting the old warehouse, about timing the attack for maximum damage during the transition period after my mother's death, about making sure the health department would have no choice but to shut down operations company-wide. His face went white. He didn't try to deny it. He just stared at the phone like it had reached across the table and grabbed him by the throat. I told him I wanted the truth, all of it, and for the next 40 minutes he gave it to me. Derek had been approached by Victor Stahl 18 months earlier. Stahl had offered him a partnership stake in Harlow and Pine, worth $15 million, in exchange for inside information that would help them compete with and eventually acquire Grace Cole's kitchen at a fraction of its value. Derek had agreed. He was the one who leaked the recipes. He was the one who provided financial documents. And when my mother died, he was the one who connected Vivian with Stahl's operation, knowing she had a personal grudge that would make her the perfect front person. But here was the part that changed everything. Derek claimed he didn't know about the contamination plan until it was already happening. He said Stahl had escalated without his approval, that the original plan was a legal challenge the 60% claim Vivian and Glenn Harker had brought to the funeral. The warehouse attack was Stahl's idea, designed to create a public health crisis that would tank the company's value and make acquisition inevitable. I asked Derek why he had gone along with any of it. He looked at me for a long time before answering. He said he had spent his entire life feeling like the outsider in our family. Same mother, different last name. He watched me inherit the company while he worked in the background. He said our mother had never offered him an ownership stake, never treated him as an equal partner, and that when Stahl offered him a seat at a table where he would actually matter, he took it. I won't pretend those words didn't land. They did. But they didn't excuse what he had done. I told him that, and he nodded like he already knew. I asked him one more question. Who was the man in Vivian's video? The one walking out of the warehouse? Derek closed his eyes. That's Stahl's fixer, he said. A guy named Lyle Brandt, ex-military private security background. Stahl uses him for jobs that need to stay off the books. Now I had the full picture. Vivian was the face. Derek was the mole, Stahl was the architect, and Brandt was the weapon. 4 people working together to dismantle everything my mother spent her life building. I spent the next 72 hours working with my attorney and a team of private investigators. We compiled everything: the server files, the recordings, the video Vivian sent me, the IP traces, the financial records linking Derek's firm to Harlow and Pine. My mother had done 90% of the work. All I had to do was finish it. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at our Lincoln Park headquarters. Every board member attended. So did 3 journalists from the Tribune and Sun-Times, whom I had personally invited under embargo. And so did Vivian, who arrived with Glenn Harker and a camera crew, apparently convinced that today was the day she would announce her takeover of Grace Cole's kitchen to the world. She walked into that conference room like she owned it, hairstyled, outfit pressed, a smile so confident it could have lit up a billboard. She sat at the far end of the table, crossed her legs, and told the room she had documentation proving my mother had promised her a controlling interest in the company through Derek's involvement. I let her talk. I let her present her forged documents. I let Glenn Harker deliver his rehearsed legal arguments. I let the camera crew record every single word. And when she was finished, when she leaned back in her chair looking like she had just won the lottery, I stood up. I played Vivian's own video first, the one she sent me, her face on that screen, smiling while confessing to contaminating a warehouse she thought was ours. The room went dead silent. Her camera crew slowly lowered their equipment. Vivian's expression crumbled like wet paper. Then I played the recordings from my mother's server. Derek discussing the plan, Stahl's emails, the financial transfers, the leaked recipes. I showed the IP logs. I showed the forged health inspection reports that Stahl's team had prepared in advance, ready to submit to regulators as soon as the contamination story broke. Finally, I played my mother's video. She had recorded it 3 weeks before she died, sitting in her test kitchen, looking exhausted but sharp as ever. She explained everything: how she discovered the conspiracy, how she moved the warehouse, how she restructured the company to withstand exactly this kind of attack. She looked directly into the camera and said that if her son was watching this, it meant the wolves had come, and she wanted him to know that she had spent her last months making sure the wolves would find nothing but their own teeth. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system humming above us. 2 federal agents entered the room before Vivian could stand up. They had warrants for her arrest tied to the warehouse contamination, which, because it involved food products intended for public consumption, carried federal charges. Glenn Harker immediately began distancing himself, claiming he had no knowledge of any criminal activity. Vivian turned to him with a look of pure disbelief, and for one moment, I almost felt something for her. Almost. Stahl was arrested that same afternoon at Harlow and Pine's headquarters in Milwaukee. Investigators found evidence that the contamination plot was part of a larger pattern. Stahl had used similar tactics against 2 smaller restaurant chains in Minnesota and Ohio over the previous 5 years, forcing them into distressed sales. Brandt, his fixer, was picked up at a motel in Gary, Indiana, still carrying chemical containers in the trunk of his rental car. Derek cooperated fully with investigators. His testimony was instrumental in building the federal case against Stahl. The judge took that into consideration during sentencing, but Derek still faced charges for corporate espionage and conspiracy. He accepted a plea deal that included 18 months in a minimum security facility and full restitution. The day after the board meeting, I sat in my mother's test kitchen alone. The house was quiet. Rain was tapping against the basement windows. I opened her recipe binder again, flipping through pages of notes and sketches and measurements that represented a lifetime of work. And tucked between the pages, for her cornbread recipe, the one she taught me when I was 8, was one final note. Nathan, if you're reading this, you did it. I'm proud of you. But the company was never the point. The point was the people we fed, the lives we touched, the doors we opened for people who looked like us and came from where we came from. Don't let anyone turn this into just a business. Keep it a family. Beneath the note was a folder I had never seen before. Inside was a detailed plan for a culinary training program designed for young people aging out of foster care. My mother had sketched out the curriculum, identified potential locations, even drafted partnership agreements with community colleges across Illinois and Wisconsin. She had been working on this during her final weeks, between chemotherapy sessions, between hospital visits, between the quiet hours when she knew her time was running out. I sat there holding that folder and cried for the first time since she died. Not from grief, though, that was there too, but from the overwhelming realization that my mother had spent her last breath not protecting a business, but planting seeds for people she would never meet. In the months that followed, I restructured Grace Cole's Kitchen with that vision at its center. We launched the training program in 3 cities. We shifted 10% of our annual revenue into community food access initiatives. I asked Dolores, my mother's oldest friend and a 30-year veteran of the company, to join the board as vice chair. And I renamed the original Pilsen restaurant, the one where it all started, the Grace Cole Community Kitchen, where every Sunday, anyone could walk in and eat for free. The company didn't just survive, it grew. Revenue increased by 14% in the first year after the crisis, driven by a wave of public support from customers who had followed the story and wanted to stand behind what my mother built. Vivian received 4 years, Stahl received 12, Brandt received 6. Derek served his 18 months and, upon release, asked if there was any way he could help with the training program. I told him I would think about it. I'm still thinking. Standing in that test kitchen now, I sometimes catch the smell of cumin and lavender, and for a second it feels like she's still here. Like she's leaning over my shoulder, checking my measurements, reminding me that the secret to good food isn't technique, it's caring enough to get it right. Vivian, Stahl, Derek, Brandt, none of them understood what they were really attacking. They thought they were targeting a supply chain, a brand, a balance sheet. But the foundation of Grace Cole's Kitchen was never ingredients or real estate or revenue. It was a woman who believed that feeding people was the most honest thing a person could do. And that kind of foundation doesn't crack. Not from greed, not from sabotage, not from anything. My mother set the table long before I understood what was being served. All I had to do was sit down and finish the meal. The revenge chapter is over now. What comes next is the part she always cared about more, not what was taken from us, but what we chose to give back. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me. Share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth always finds its way to the surface, even when the people hiding it think they've buried it deep enough. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and I'd rather tell them knowing you're here.